afternoon with this afternoon's panel talking about analyzing the pornographic text, charting and mapping pornography through content analysis. The three-panel discussion will consist of Robert Wosnitzer, who is an MA candidate at New York's Department of Culture and Communication. He received his bachelor's from New York University in Media Studies after a 15-year career in investment banking and finance. In addition to the current research being presented, Robert's current work involves critical engagement with media globalization, subjectivities, and effects on neoliberal policies. Robert cites his exposure to radical feminist theory as a defining transformative framework, one that rescued his struggle to escape what he describes as the pit of masculinity and the circus of global finance. Joining this panel is Anna Bridges, who has a Bachelor's of Science degree in psychology from the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign and a Master's of Science degree in clinical psychology from Illinois State University. Anna is currently a PhD candidate in clinical psychology from the University of Rhode Island. Anna has just been hired as an assistant professor of clinical psychology at the University of Arkansas. She has been researching the effects of pornography on romantic couples since 2000. Her findings have been presented in peer-reviewed academic journal articles, professional conferences, and popular outlets such as Psychology Today. The third panel member is Michelle Chang, who has a BA from Oberlin College in Ohio and a Master's in Media Studies from the New School in New York City. She has worked professionally as an associate producer for the ABC television network and is currently working on the post-production side of independent documentary films. Please welcome our afternoon panel.
Well, thank you. Everybody can hear me okay?
No.
No? Are these on?
Yeah.
Okay, is that better? Let's bring this closer. Okay, for the record, I'm Robert Wosnitzer. This is Anna Bridges. This is Michelle Chang. So we'll go through this. And before we start getting into this, I just want to make a few comments. And the very glib and trite statement about radical feminism being a transformative experience for me, as glib as it is, I wanted to bring that up because the research that we want to present today is not just research. It's actually a living practice, and how we came into this living practice about this research. No research is innocent, and certainly the personal is political. When I left Wall Street about 6 years ago, when I started to do work in media studies, I started to confront these issues, these big categories that Bob Jensen talked about earlier: race, class, gender. And it wasn't until I started to engage those issues that I started to understand my own narrative. I started to understand the privilege as a white male that I had just granted to me by the color of my skin and my biology. And the narratives and the contradictions that I experienced while I was there only made sense to me when I started to understand radical feminism. It gave the narrative to my story. It put an experience to my life. From that, I came to this research. And not only that, this is also a way of thanking Bob and Gail, not only for this presentation today, but for their years of activism and their writing. Because it wasn't until the first time that I read Bob Jensen's work that I recognized my experience as a man in this culture. And for me, that was it was a moment of like walking through sand for about 2 weeks. I knew who I was, but everything looked different. And it's been a struggle to come to terms with that, and that's where this research does come to. As I was doing this work, being confronted by these glib statements of "I love porn, porn is great," from people in the university that I was attending at the time, to "you can't define what it is such a large universe of products that there's something for everybody out there," that women are entering this business changing the content of pornography. And all of these questions, I had no real argument except to go into these long, elaborate discussions. And that's where the beginning question started with this research. And I had thought that a way to get at this was to take apart the text, look at the pieces of the content within inside pornography. I quickly realized I was in incredibly far over my head. And that's when I came in touch and had the incredibly good fortune to know Anna and Michelle. And I want to acknowledge Dr. Erica Shar from UMass Amherst, who's not able to be here today, has an absolute incredible resource and co-author and mentor through this project in helping us chart this project out. The project's been nearly 3 years at this point, and we'll get into some of the details as we go. But it was also about how this research project and what an incredible experience it was. And the reason why I want to bring that up is not so much to inspire, but if you do have ideas, if there are those questions that are plaguing you, you do find yourself over your head, ask for help. There's many of us out here who would love to find more projects to get involved in. It was an incredibly enriching experience and one that continues today. As I'm here faced with figuring out where I'm going next in my doctoral studies, and I'm being encouraged to leave the porn thing behind, it certainly underscores the importance of doing this work. If I'm already experiencing some form of discipline towards my academic work, that this is okay and this is not okay, because the porn thing isn't taken seriously enough. As we were talking about earlier in some of the presentations about how in the academy porn is being talked about. It's not serious, it's not worth considering. Well, I insistently think that's fundamentally flawed to think that way. And if anything, then I'm being encouraged not to pursue this in my doctoral studies. It gives me more reason to study it. So, with that, I would like, why don't we just get into some of our work, and what we'd like to do is we'd like to play a clip. It's just about a minute and a half that pretty much frames the way that this has framed our research and where our questions have come from. So if we can hit the next slide.
We all think that we somehow come here fully equipped to enjoy sexuality in all of its explicitness, but you know, we really do need a lot of instruction, just like we need to be taught how to eat properly, how to dress properly. Every aspect of our lives, we take lessons and we educate ourselves.
Early on when I was reporting, as someone who had nearly no exposure to pornography at all, my astonishment that these young women would watch porn as literally instructional videos, you know, how to learn how to position themselves better or how to give better blowjobs, which I thought was really great, because for me it was just laced with such shame.
Sometimes you think, I never even thought of doing that. Or there's some things that you sell and maybe would be disgusting, but then you see it in porno with like great looking people. I think, well, I never tried that. Maybe I'll save that one for the autumn of my years.
You know, when you're not really comfortable in your own skin.
And more unnerving, one day on Sophia's set, another girl is injured when her partner gets too rough.
And I think he saw the opportunity to kind of take advantage of that. You know, I wasn't really going to say much. I wasn't going to stop the scene altogether because I'm still new and I don't want to be blacklisted.
Girls in the industry walk a fine line.
And then Daisy turns to you and pushes you back and starts to get into you.
Filmmakers are now pushing performers more and more to extremes. Sophia is nervous about the pressure to perform sex acts she's uncomfortable with.
I see these girls and these guys that do things and I'm like, you did what today? Like, oh, and I just cringe and like get the chills thinking about it.
Action.
For Sophia,
so the reason why I chose those two clips to show, and for the record, the first clip is from an HBO documentary special called Thinking XXX, which was a 1-hour documentary special. It aired about a year ago when the photographer Timothy Greenfield Sanders decided to make an art book of 30 porn stars using a rationale of a famous art project of 30 famous artists. So he's wrapping it in these high-minded ideas, and part of his publishing deal with Time Warner was that he also got to direct his own special on HBO featuring these porn stars, which, let's also remember, is owned by Time Warner as well, in addition to a CD and music deal that he got from Warner Records, all from taking 30 photographs of porn stars. And that was from the documentary special where he had Gore Vidal and Faye Waddleton and John Waters and a bunch of other cultural critics waxing philosophically about pornography. The second clip was just aired about 10 days ago on ABC, a special, The Outsiders, which was taking yet another mainstream media inside look. And I think what's remarkable about these two clips is they both say the same thing. They say that, if we can have the next slide, please. Both of those clips say that aggression and violent pornography is the exception and not the rule. So on the first clip, what you saw was a group of critics and activists and whatever they may claim to be or not be, a disembodied experience referring to pornography has this amorphous mass that we really don't know what it is, and it's celebratory and it's wonderful and great and teaches us wonderful things. So raising the question, if pornography is a pedagogical tool, what is it educating us towards? And in our findings we'll go through and we'll discover what it is teaching us in very specific terms. The second part of that clip is mainstream media discounting the embodied experience. This is the personal narrative of somebody inside that industry, claiming that more and more people are doing, somebody who was injured during a scene. And the way it's presented in that show, that 1-hour program, was that this is the exception and not the rule, that this is an increasing trend of some kind. I think what we will claim, and you'll see as we do, that aggressive and violent pornography is the rule. It's not the exception. So I want to take you through how we got some of the issues that came up. If we could have the next slide, please. In prior research, as I said, when I started thinking about these questions, I went back and looked at, we're not the first people to do a content analysis study of pornography. Neil Malamuth has done some incredible work early on about print magazines. There's a whole host of studies out there, but one of the things that we realized was that there's a sampling bias. In other words, when people went out to discover what's in the pornographic material that's available on the market, they would walk into a video store and say, what are the 25 most popular tapes people come in and rent? Now, certainly
in North Dakota.
In North Dakota or wherever it may be. And certainly, yes, it brings up a lot of socioeconomic biases. Who are these people? What part of the country are they in? Where is it coming from? Is it representative of, say, the United States at large? It was very ad hoc and systematic. Other times, if certain researchers were looking for a very specific genre, they wanted to look at interracial text, which is very important studies, and I encourage people to read Gloria Cowan's work. I think she's done incredible work. So they would look at very specific narrow texts. Or some people would look at internet, and it's very difficult to know who's looking at what on the internet at any given time. So when we talk about sampling biases, these are some of the things that occurred, and we'll go through in how we overcame these things. The other issue that we had was narrow definitions of aggression that were deployed in other studies. In other words, how do you know aggression when you see it? This was always the first question we would come up. Some researchers would describe the act of spanking, which you see in pornography constantly, has culturally accepted rituals, which didn't really quite sit right with us because it didn't seem like we had necessarily accepted it or that everybody had accepted it. The fact that they were saying it was culturally accepted did not make it so. So in other words, what we wanted to get at was what is constitutive of aggression? How is aggression comprised? In other words, a slap is a slap is a slap, and then we could code for that. We could quantify that and count it. And we can count everything else that's going on in that scene and then look at the entire field in entirety and recontextualize it for interpretation without everything occurring at once. The other thing that a lot of previous research, they would code for what they would call non-normative sexual acts, and it varied on what a normative sexual act was and a non-normative sexual act. So we just said we wanted to code for every single way that sexuality is appearing, because also the claim that pornography is sexuality or is sexual liberation, which is a dubious claim at best, I think we want to look at, if that is their claim, then what kind of sexuality are they proposing? Okay, so in some ways, what I'm getting at too is we're also taking a look at the arguments that you'll hear from pro-pornography and somewhat accepting them and trying to prove them. And in doing that, we disprove them. We also realize that, as well as we look for aggression and we look for violence in the way it's initiated and acted, there was an incredible focus on negatives. In other words, nobody had ever coded for positive acts. Again, it's very important in research to disprove what your hypothesis may be. So if our hypothesis was, and from looking at what's in most of the popular market, we had suspected it was going to be aggressive, but we wouldn't know until we got in there. So one of the things we said is let's code for positive behaviors. How do we do that? We took a list of, and we'll get into this a little bit more later as well, marital, and Anna was really instrumental in deciding this part, being a couples therapist and a psychologist. What are the different markers of sexually healthy relationships, sexually healthy acts? So we coded for those as well. And the last piece I want to bring up is lack of context. that often in prior research they would look at aggression, they would look at sex act, and that was it. What we wanted to start to do is that the extreme sex acts are there, and how is sexuality and aggression being fused together in one scene? And not only how is it being fused together in one scene, but this is critical in terms of the narrow definition of aggression, which hinged on intent more often than not. And intent in film or in any representation can be manufactured. How do we know? So if it is manufactured, we wanted to code exactly how it was being responded to. So when an act of aggression did occur, we wanted to know what was the response of the person being aggressed. Did they say this is great and this is wonderful? Which is really different when you think about aggression appearing in television or Hollywood films. Okay, typically when aggression occurs in television studies, there's usually some bad consequence to it. You know, somebody's either punished or they're hunted down or killed or something else, which are their own problems. But in pornography, with the thing that it always kind of reached its logical conclusion. So if we could have the next slide, please. How we overcame some of these obstacles. We did, these are some of the things we did. We sampled popular pornography, accepted definitions and methods, coding for extreme sexual acts. Some of these things I've gone through. The aggression in context. In terms of, if we could have the next slide, population and sample, the way we went about doing this to figure out, and the results, and I'm going to preface this, the results that we're going to share with you today. When somebody asks you the question, and let's remember the audience for pornography, despite what anybody wants to say, is predominantly male. When people are asking the question, what are men watching? The results that we're going to give you are going to answer that question. Because what we did is we went through Adult Video News every month, publishes a list of the top 250 best sold and rented adult DVDs, which also we avoided the issue of what is pornography because AVN defined it for us, in a sense. So every month they have that. And also, let's be clear too, the majority of people still do watch and consume sexually explicit material through DVD and VHS. It is still the predominant way it occurs. Yes, the internet is a big thing, but it's not where people are spending time with pornography from the studies we've seen, and we do have some numbers that back that up. So we went through, we had 250 films each month. We took the top 50 from each month, went back over a 6-month period, randomly generated, took the top 50 films. We coded by scene. We had a total of 304 scenes that we coded over this randomly generated list of the top 50 films. If we could have the next clip. Next slide, I'm sorry. Definitions and method. Just so we want to make you aware, and I think I just need to make a couple points on this. You can read aggression and violence defined as any action causing or attempting to cause physical or psychological harm to oneself, to another person, animal or inanimate object, intentionally or accidentally, whereby physical harm is understood as assaulting another verbally and non-verbally. So we have two forms of aggression with this definition. We have both verbal and non-verbal. So we have verbal and physical is how we started to categorize these two things. It also, this is a socially scientific acceptable definition. And for the record, we have not published this research yet. It's in the process of being published. It has been accepted to scholarly conferences, peer-reviewed. This isn't some ad hoc study that we just said, look at what we got and cooked up some numbers. So this is a socially scientific proven definition of aggression and violence that can be deployed and that we did use. It also removes the problematic of intent and allows us to get at what is constitutive of aggression. Now the PAT method was deployed. It was a method that was used by the National Television Violence Study, again, a socially scientific definition. PAT stands for perpetrator, action, and target. So we have this very liberal definition of aggression, and granted, I will say it is liberal. We wanted to be inclusive to understand it. But by using the PAT technique, what we're doing, you only code for one act if one of those variables change. So in other words, if the perpetrator, one man, the act, let's call it a kick, kicks the target, T, 7 times, we only count it once. It's when the P changes, if another man enters that scene and kicks the same target, we code the second act, even though there may have been 8. So what we have is this mitigating factor that we have this liberal definition, but at the same time we're constraining it for the actual shared number to come up with what we feel is a very solid number that gets at the specific aggression that's present. I'd be happy, I don't want to spend too much time on PAT, but I'd be happy to talk about it if you have any questions on it later. Next slide, thank you. There we go, methods. Contextualizing aggression is rather than, and where we're going with this is some of the other prior research would a priori define what degradation was through either sexual acts or ejaculation or something like that. And we didn't want to, because we do start getting some definitional problems of what is degradation. It's contextualized, certainly. So we wanted to, again, parse out these different things and then try to recontextualize them. So rather than defining these things as degrading, we contextualize the presence of the sexual acts in relation to the verbal and physical aggression that's occurring within the scene. Response to aggression. So what, again, we asked, how did the victim respond when aggressed? Did the victim respond passively, neutrally? Did the victim respond with pleasure? Did the victim respond, did the victim object in any way and say, stop that, don't do that? And the perpetrator listened to that and said, okay? Or when the victim said, stop, did the perpetrator then become more aggressive in response? So these were the four responses we were coding for to contextualize whether or not some things may or may not be degrading. And again, we try to avoid making those claims. But I think we're better able to understand how aggression is naturalized, especially in the context of sexual behavior, which is the key to this study, I think, is in what ways are these things becoming naturalized. If we could have the next slide. And I will turn it over to Anna to go through the results from here.
So I'm going to begin to talk about what it is that we found after looking at these 304 scenes and these 50 top-selling pornographic films. In total, in the 304 scenes, we've coded a total of 3,376 acts of aggression. That ends up averaging, if you look at the amount of time, it ends up averaging to an aggressive act every minute and a half. The scenes on average contained 11.5 acts of verbal or physical aggression, and they ranged anywhere from 0 to up 128 in one scene. That's sort of the big picture. We're going to really break it down now and try to, again, put a context around it. Next slide, please. So who's having sex? I mean, if this is where we're getting our sex education, let's find out who's having it before we talk about what it looks like. White people are having sex. As it turns out, white people under age 30 are the ones who are having sex. So if you're trying to say that this is a way that we learn about it, we teach it, this is where adolescents are getting ideas and sex education, it's a very narrow definition. It's for a very narrow population. And this is, again, in the best-selling.
And about the gender?
Gender was about equally distributed. Thank you for reminding me. We had about 47% were women and about 53% men. Next slide, please. So again, if we're thinking about this as part of where people get sex education, let's find out, you know, they're being safe, they're talking about these things, all the things that our, 9th grade sexual health classes talked about. And condoms were present in 11% of the scenes, which is good. Not enough, but it's a start. A discussion of let's be safe or put on a condom or something of that happened in, I believe that amounts to one scene of the 304. Nice education. Sign my kid up. Next slide, please. One of the beauties of having done this project was that we were able to code the sex acts and also compare them to the study that had been done in 1994. It was a very large national survey of actual adult sex practices. And so we were able to say, well, how well is pornography, popular pornography, portraying the reality of sex as it is actually being practiced and desired? So female to male oral sex was grossly overrepresented in pornography compared to this national survey. Same with anal penetration. I think 1 to 2% of people said, yeah, that's great, I want to do it, but in 56% of scenes, we're seeing anal penetration being shown. Female to female oral was shown 23% of scenes, and less than 1% of women said that this was something they found very appealing or did. What it essentially amounted to is that the desires and sexual practices of men were well represented or overrepresented, and the desires and sexual practices of women were grossly underrepresented.
Yeah, if I can jump in, there's just one quick point I want to make about this as well, and not to overstate this by any stretch of the imagination. Comparing it to the text that we used is a study by Lauman and Associates from 1994, The Social Organization of Sexuality, which was a comprehensive study of actual sexual practices and sexual preferences of Americans across race, class, all sorts. It was a very comprehensive study. And the reason why we wanted to look at that was in talking with pornographers, and their claim is, if people are out there doing this, I have a right to represent this. Now, maybe we can argue that all we want, but then the question is, okay, to what extent are people actually engaging in these acts? And in which ways is pornography, and this is where I would argue this helps us start to begin to understand the ideological construction of the text. This starts to, if Stuart Hall, a very influential media theorist, talks about a media text as being a bid for power. Any media text is a bid for power. What bid does this tell us? What message is being transmitted about who gets to say what and why? So I don't want to make too much of that, but I think it starts to get at some of the points we were trying to make.
Next slide, please. We also coded for what we're calling loosely in this talk extreme acts of sex acts. The only sexual sequence that we coded, which is sort of when one thing follows another, was something called ATM, not an automatic teller machine, but ass to mouth. This literally involves anal penetration followed by oral sex. And I think Gail Dines has put it beautifully when she said she is literally eating her own shit. That occurred in 41% of the scenes that we coded. Just sort of let that sink in a little. Lauman didn't assess it in his survey of Americans.
Now, Lauman didn't assess any of these acts. He didn't think to ask these questions. Are people doing this? So.
Furthermore, every single one of these acts, as a whole, these extreme acts, these were the only acts that were predictive of aggression in the scene. So if you actually say, can the kind of sex acts that are happening, can that tell us anything about whether a scene is going to be aggressive? Yes. These tell you the likelihood of there being other kinds of aggression in the scene when these sex acts were represented was about anywhere between 4 and 8 times more likely. Next slide, please. Because we're, again, trying to build a context, we coded ejaculation location without trying to talk too much about what it means. You can see that on the mouth was by far the most common place for the ejaculation to happen. Multiple and other included things like, again, multiple locations, the anus, feet, thighs, and so forth. Those were the most common locations. And we'll leave it to you to interpret. Next slide, please. So how many scenes actually didn't contain aggression? About 10%. That was it. Almost 90% of the scenes that we coded contained at least one act of verbal or physical aggression. Next one, please. And here's what they looked like. For verbal aggression, by far, name-calling and insulting were the most common types. They were seen in almost half of scenes. And again, recall, if somebody says, you bitch, slut, whore, that gets counted as one act. Coercive language, threat of physical harm were present less often, but mostly it was just a very insulting, very degrading kind of a speech. Next one, please. I don't want to overwhelm you too much with numbers, but physical aggression happened a lot, and these are the kinds of things we coded. Spanking, gagging in, I think, gagging and choking were much, much more common than any of us thought when we first walked into this project. Slapping, pushing, biting, kicking, use of weapons. I now work at a crime victim center. We see children and adults who've been the victims of sexual violence. And the intake that we use when someone walks in the door to code their violence was almost identical to the coding scheme that we used for this particular project. I found that really remarkable. Next slide, please. So, but bringing back context. So yes, slapping happened 30% of the time. Who is aggressing and who is receiving that aggression? Most of the aggressors in these films were men. Not surprising, I'm sure, 73%. By far, the most common recipient of the aggression was a woman. Even when women were aggressing, they were generally aggressing other women. Next slide, please. How did the person respond when they were aggressed? This is, I think, another important piece to adding the context. In 95% of these 3,000 and some acts of aggression, the person was either neutral, as in no change of facial expression or verbal expression, or was sort of saying, that feels great, keep doing it, right on. And in only 3% did we see some overt expression of displeasure or pain. Again, it seems to be very important to the people who are watching this to believe that the recipient of aggression is in fact enjoying it, is choosing it at some level. Next slide, please. So in psychology, my field, we don't know a ton about human behavior, but there is one thing we do know, and that's that people imitate what they see others get rewarded for doing. So if you watch a movie and you see that somebody, picks up a book or plays with a certain doll and then they get some candy, little kids will go and do the same thing when they have a chance to interact with the doll or pick up a book. And so we were very interested in saying, okay, yes, people are aggressed, but let's take a look at what it's teaching us about it as viewers. And what we found was that, again, in the majority of cases, being the aggressor was something that paid off. It was reinforcing. It made it more likely that the behavior would happen again. And if you're the one who's watching it, it makes it more likely that you're going to say, yeah, that sounds pretty good. They seem to like it. My girlfriend probably would too. In no case, in zero out of the over 3,000 acts, was the person in some way punished or discouraged from aggressing. Now, I do understand that there are some films out there that maybe are specifically designed to show the person in pain. And we had some great examples before about sex slaves and torture videos. We're looking again at the most popular pornography, and in this case, it seems that the expression of pleasure at being aggressed and it being a rewarding experience is very important. Next slide, please. We talked about how we coded for positive behaviors. We felt that it was very important to say, if you're looking for something, if you're not looking for something, you're guaranteed not to find it. And because we wanted to make sure that we weren't just looking for negative things, we wanted to say, well, okay, maybe it's teaching us some good things as well. And in fact, again, in couples research, we know that couples, even couples who fight a lot, as long as there's a lot of good in the relationship, about 5 times more good than bad, they actually do pretty well. And so it might be important to see, if there's a lot of good, then maybe this aggressive act's within the context of a lot of good wouldn't be that big of a deal. But it turns out not to be the case, probably not surprising. So less than 10% of the videos showed any kind of a positive act, and that included kissing, and kissing of any kind. We didn't try to figure out whether it was kissing that was exaggerative or clown-like or any of it. I think caressing happened maybe twice. Something like a verbal compliment, gosh, you look pretty, not slutch, bitch, come over here. That happened maybe 5 times in the 304 scenes. So we have a ratio of positive to negative behaviors of 1 to 9, which is not a sustainable, happy relationship. I try to tell my husband that. Next slide, please. And we're actually going to get back to one of the issues that was brought up earlier today, which is well, you know, maybe we just go out and make femme porn. We get more females to direct it, and then it'll be more egalitarian. It'll be the kind of thing that we can all embrace and say, yes, this is what we want. Well, of the popular films that we coded, less than 7% were directed by females, so still very dominated by male-directed films. And we are now in the process of writing our second article from this study, in which we look at female-directed films specifically, and guess what? They're not different, not the best-selling popular ones. They're, on the whole, just as violent, just as aggressive. The one difference we've noted consistently is that they tend to show much more female-to-female aggression. So they're actually more aggressive women on women, sister to sister. And the final slide, please. Next one. So what can we say as a whole? Taking all of this information together, we're telling you again that violence and aggression in popular pornography is the rule, not the exception. If you were disturbed by some of the images you saw earlier today, don't discount them as, well, that was the most extreme example. That's not the case. The rule is aggression. Extreme acts occur commonly, and they predict aggression. There is a relative absence of positive portrayals of sexuality. If this is what our sex education is, I am very afraid for my kids, very afraid for myself, very afraid for my friends. There's also a differential level of aggression. If it's egalitarian, then men and women should be aggressing and receiving aggression at about equal numbers, and that is absolutely not the case. Men are aggressing three times more often, or 75% of times, and women are receiving that aggression about 95% of the time. And also, in terms of it being a learned behavior, we are teaching people, the education piece here is we are teaching people to aggress. We are teaching people that slapping your girlfriend during the process of having sex is something she will enjoy. Next slide, please. We've taken you through the process of a research study that, as Robert has pointed out, it took us years to do, and I'm amazed that we've just summarized it here in 20 minutes and reduced it to that. So in this process, we thought that the context in which aggression occurred was of utmost importance, and so many of the things that we did were centered around putting a context around aggression. The problem is that when we thought about how to do this research project, we forgot context. We completely forgot the fact that we are actually asking 3 people to sit down and watch 50 videos with 304 scenes for over 300 hours. And so in order to talk about that, I'd like to introduce you to Michelle Sheng, who was one of our coders and whose work you just saw represented up here, whose hours of work you saw.
And before Michelle starts, and I just want to not so much frame what Michelle has to say, but also just explain the process a little bit of what we were asking coders to do. And I was incredibly remiss at the beginning of this talk not to mention Gabrielle Shaw and Christine Larson, who unfortunately weren't able to make it up here today, but were our 2 other coders. In addition to watching these films and coding them, the coding process was about slowing these films down and having to look at all the things that people who typically watch pornography either try not to see or just are lost in the process, as Bob Jensen eloquently puts it, getting off. So we are asking our coders to do an incredible job, and I cannot, words escape the difficulty of that job, what we're asking them to do, but also how grateful we are that they are willing to do this job and go through it. And I think it's incredibly important and incredibly powerful that not only this conference is here, but that the work that this does in our own research and also through the experience of the coders, that we all know engaging this topic can be isolating and lonely. Engaging in this topic makes you feel crazy sometimes. That I see things in a way that nobody else sees them. What am I supposed to do with that? I know when Anna and Eric and I had to come up with a coding scheme, we had to look at a lot of these films to try to come up with our coding scheme. And I can remember walking around with these images in my head, the streets of New York City, looking at everybody as I was seeing them in pornography. It's a very, and I know all of you have dealt with this, understand what I'm saying when I say that. And so I'm not trying to frame Michelle's question, but I'm just trying to, I could only get a small fraction of what our coders did over a 6-month process by looking at 4 or 5 films and coming up with a coding scheme. So, and I just want to extend my heartfelt appreciation to Michelle and the coders. And I think it's incredibly important that Michelle also shares her experience in this coding process with us. So, with that.
Thanks. So as I said, I'm here to sort of represent the coders and talk a bit about what that process was like. And I think it's great that I've been given that space to do that, and that it's acknowledged that you know, the work was significant and at times very difficult. And the other 2 coders couldn't be here, and I think a lot of our sentiments were probably shared, but again, I want to be clear that I'm speaking from my own experience, and I can only kind of speak about the particular films that I saw. In terms of my previous exposure to hardcore pornography before participating in this study, it was very little. I had only seen probably a handful of hardcore films in my lifetime, and nothing really in recent years. So what I thought going into it, I didn't really feel that pornography factored into my life very much at all. You know, and my boyfriend doesn't watch it, and not many people I know watch it, so I kind of thought about it more abstractly. It's that thing that's, you know, I know it's out there, but if anything, it's just this kind of like ridiculous or funny thing that I know about, but don't really know about. So going into this study, I expected that it would be unpleasant, especially knowing that the study was going to be about violence and aggression in pornography. I assumed it was going to be really weird to watch that much pornography and to, you know, bring it into my home. But really, and also there was always this possibility that there would be some titillation involved, that it would be, you know, arousing in some way. I just didn't know. So mostly I didn't know what to expect going in, and I didn't really go in with a sort of agenda of any kind. So overall, I watched 33 films, and I don't know how many scenes that came out to, but they average anywhere from like 5 to 10 scenes. And it was over the course of a few months. And the beginning of the study is really kind of baptism by fire, because, you know, the films we watched, the sample was like randomly generated titles, so it wasn't as if you could say, let's start with the most mild one, and then we'll, you know, work our way up to the more intense ones. So to give you an example, one of the first films that we watched, and that the coders all watched, was called Teen Fuckholes. And the title pretty much, I think, gives you an idea of what that film was about. You know, really aggressive, nasty attitude, and a really quick introduction for me to some of the kind of common sex acts, some things that Gail talked about, like gagging and gaping and anal sex, double penetration, ass to mouth, all these things. And we were working out the coder reliability at that time, and so I had to watch that film 3 times. So that pretty much I knew it was going to be a really long haul and a kind of difficult one, so I had to steel myself. So after this kind of initial group period, we were all assigned our own films. You know, we'd get a few at a time, you know, watch them, code them, and then Robert would kind of deal out our next batch. And the process of coding, you know, to be clear, is like a really intense, you know, as Robert was saying, it's quantitative. We're having to count and catch everything. We had to watch the films from beginning to end, you know, sound up, stopping and pausing to, you know, really code properly and get everything. Also keeping journals to kind of reflect on what, you know, what we're thinking about everything. And it's really, like, you really had to commit to watching. It's a really intense experience, not a light one. And, you know, there's literally like a chart that you're coding these numbers and the level of aggression, what are the acts, how are people responding, and you really start to see it, you know, pile up in a really concrete way, like slap here, gag here, you know, pulling hair, filthy pig, dirty bitch, whatever. You see the whole thing really pile up. And I got a really quick sense of what's common in pornography. I would say most of the films I saw were what Gail described earlier as that sort of wall-to-wall sex acts, which, again, are films where, you know, there's nothing to kind of string the scenes together. There's no pretense. People just kind of show up and the sex acts commence, and it's usually, you know, it might start with a woman, maybe she's masturbating, then, you know, oral sex, maybe a gagging sequence if it's in that scene, then vaginal penetration, anal penetration, maybe double penetration, combinations of everything, ejaculation usually in the mouth or on the face, wave goodbye, fade to black, fade up, same thing all over again. And again, these kind of more extreme acts like gagging, gaping, ATM were things I really had no idea about before participating in this study. And gagging in particular was something that I don't think I ever really got over seeing, and that continued to be really difficult to see. And the gagging sort of happens in two ways. One is more of an overtly kind of forced gagging, where the woman is forced to, you know, the penis is forced down her throat to trigger that gag reflex, and it's either held down or rammed down her throat repeatedly. And as you saw in Gail's slideshow, they often have to take their hands away, keep their heads up, keep their eyes open, and their eyes are usually watering or tearing because that's just the instinct when you're gagging. And the other way that it happens, though, is that the women are actually initiating the gagging. They're really kind of doing it to themselves. And if there's no men around, if it's a, you know, all-female scene or female-directed thing, they'll find other ways. They'll take giant dildos, sex toys, and gag themselves, use their own hands, feet, whatever. So that, I will say, and then the language around that also, it's like, I want to fuck your face, throat fucking, choke on it. I mean, it's, that to me, it just was always really difficult to see, and I couldn't quite wrap my head around that. So these things were initially shocking, or surprising at least, because I didn't know. But over time, I did become desensitized to seeing these things, because as I saw them normalized in the films, they became normalized for me as a viewer, and I just started to expect them. Even if they never became comfortable to see, I expected them. And anal penetration, for example, when that didn't happen within a film, I was surprised. I felt there's something missing, this is really mild, you know, where's the anal penetration? And again, in all-female scenes, there was still anal penetration. They'd find ways with sex toys to penetrate themselves, and often in a more severe way. So the result, I mean, the effect of seeing this is just, you start to like glaze over and you kind of get this numb, and it becomes really boring, in fact, to see these things over and over again. And again, it's wall to wall. There's no story, no plot, no characters, nothing to fall back on. It's just wall to wall, very graphic, anatomical, aggressive sex acts. And they just drone on and on and on. And the scenes could last 30, 50 minutes. The films could be 3 hours. And, you know, sometimes you just wanted to shoot yourself. And actually having to watch all these films, really turned pornography into something abstract, as I was saying, I thought about it in the beginning, to something really concrete. Just seeing the real bodies and doing these real acts, they really transform from being not just screen images or text. And in the wall-to-wall films, the kind of that aura of reality is even stronger. You know, even though I'm watching and I know that it's staged and they're paid and maybe they're laughing and joking around between takes, that's what they like to show in the behind the scenes anyway. It's that charge of reality that runs through the films, which I think is the real appeal. And the stars, you know, they all have these fake names, but they essentially star as themselves in the film. So there's a real lack of, you know, there's no line between the porn star and the real woman. And I think that's intentionally blurry because you really focused on this real woman going through this real thing. And when I look at it, I'm concerned about that real woman. But when other people look at it, it's like that spectacle of the real woman enduring something. And I probably saw through the course of it, you know, 150 individual women going through this. And that was really different than just kind of thinking about porn as an abstract concept. And I couldn't know the history of any of these women. I didn't assume that they were coerced or that they had abuse in their past. You know, I just couldn't know. And I also didn't condemn them or have bad feelings towards them. You know, I mostly felt empathy for them. And knowing that these were choices that they made and that they felt that those were the best choices for them. And then what I'm seeing on screen, there's also a problem of choice, because through all the violence and aggression that I'm seeing, again, as the numbers reflect, the women always want it, they always take it, and they always like it, essentially, no matter what's happening to them. And that really kind of rendered the violence, any violence that was going on became kind of invisible. And that made it that even made it even more difficult for me, worse for me to watch than if it was a kind of overt violence where women were fighting back, because it was like they were choosing it. The message was like, the true nature of women is that they're all, you know, masochists, which, you know, was really troubling to me. Also, as Robert was talking about, when you're watching a lot of hardcore pornography, those images, those sounds really sear into your brain. And you can't help but start to look at everything. When you step back out into the world, you look at everything through that pornified lens, and you start to see everyone as reduced to these kind of crude sex objects, women especially. And you know, imagining them in these, you know, pornographic scenarios. And even something as simple as a kind of, you know, porny outfit, which I see all the time on the street and I see all the time on, you know, young girls in middle school, I feel like those women are wearing those outfits and they probably haven't even watched a lot of porn, but for the men who are looking at them, they've watched a lot of porn, and, you know, semiotically, they're picking up on that association for sure. At the same time, I felt that I'm watching all this porn, but I'm disconnected from the people who I know are watching all the porn, you know, the porn viewers, because I felt like I didn't know who those people were, but I imagined that they're watching all this porn and they're not having a problem with it, not having an issue with it, which was really scary to me. And it felt like, you know, they're probably all out in the world right around me or standing right in front of me on the train, and I just don't know unless they were to harass me, which is quite possible, or make some, you know, jackass comment. And, but that, you know, and I know for one of the other coders left, you know, it can leave you feeling really vulnerable when you're watching all this really violent imagery and then, you know, stepping out into the world. And also, and then on the other side, you feel like you're carrying this really heavy burden, all this terrible knowledge, and then people around you, or what I found, my experience was that the people around me don't know anything about pornography. You know, this audience here can empathize, and that's comforting, but the, you know, just regular people I know don't think it's a big deal, or think pornography is just kind of a harmless entertainment, or it's a joke, or they're a little squeamish about it, or whatever. They just don't know. So no one defaults to talking about it seriously. And that became incredibly frustrating for me, because I just felt like that weird freak who was watching all the pornography and getting into a rage about it all the time. And I knew that if I were to engage someone, it was going to have to be this all or none kind of conversation, and I would have to bombard them with all this, terrible stuff. And so, a lot of times, I just felt like I didn't want to go there. And so I ended up internalizing a lot of it, just, keeping it to myself. Although I will say that my boyfriend, who I've been with for 8 years, was incredibly important and supportive in this process, and was always very open to talking with me about it and letting me vent and thinking about it critically with me. So, that was really important. And if I hadn't had that during the study, I think it might have been very different for me. So, for the people that don't know about the pornography, the question I would start to ask was, is that a good kind of ignorance? If they don't know anything about it and don't watch it and it doesn't, factor into their lives, then shouldn't I let them just keep not knowing anything about it? Does it matter for those people? And I think in the end, I realized it definitely does matter. Because watching the pornography made me understand that pornography is something that happens in the world that I live in, and it has an effect. It's not just this kind of separate text to critique, and that cumulative effect of seeing so many women, this endless supply of women who are willing to choose to do this, and an endless demand for that, and the demand, of course, accounts for the supply. But just the hugeness and the magnitude of it really started to, depress me and trouble me. And I started to see it as not just a problem with the porn industry, as other people today have said, but the porn industry is an extreme symptom of a much larger problem, with the culture, and indicative of a larger attitude towards women in the culture. And doing this study just really made me feel sick in that way, that, when you just take away all the bullshit, like, this is what it comes down to, This is what we're capable of, this is what we as a culture accept, and that we're all complicit in, and that, is something I think is important to confront, not only for people who are the consumers of pornography, but for everyone. And finally, so that said, the study was difficult, but I don't have any regrets in having participated in it. I can't erase all the things that I saw, but I think they'll fade over time, and I think I'll be okay. And that the consciousness that I came to through watching it, that's something that won't fade, and I'm glad for that. And I'm proud to have been a part of this study, and I'm glad to see, that what I went through in that work is going to become something that, will transcend beyond my individual consciousness or whatever. So I'm glad to be here to be able to share that experience.
Thank you, Michelle. That was very good to hear. And I think one of the things that we wanted to also talk about, and this is a very good time to open it to questions, is raising the issue of ethics in this type of research. I think it's a very important topic that we really had no roadmap to follow. In retrospect, and all of us, the authors of the paper, when we sat down, we said we wish we had a roadmap to follow. We wish we would have been able to do things or anticipate what the consequences may or may not have been on the people we're asking to do this work. So some very brief ideas towards that, especially in this type of coding idea. I think one of the things is that, and especially this is from the impact of the coders telling us how they felt, what happened, what we could have done better. and it was criticism that was wholeheartedly embraced. And I think first and foremost, doing this type of research, we can never escape the gender issue. One of our coders, when she came to the interview, had to promise to call her mother to make sure that she was safe. And she had an interview with me, so what, you know, our biology aside, we can't forget that we're bringing in the cultural codes of gender into this project, and that it's very important that our gender roles are acknowledged, we understand them, and that there is no, it's taken into account. So, and that especially when you have to watch this type of material in mixed gender, when there's male and female researchers. We can't just say it doesn't matter. It does matter, and we have to be aware of it. I think the other thing that we need to do when we do this type of work is provide a safe space. One of the largest mistakes that we all regret is that when we had given the films to the coders to code, we'd ask them to take them home. And all of them, and I think Michelle, correct me if I'm wrong, had described the experience of feeling as if their home was invaded, that it wasn't safe. And that was an incredible, incredible oversight on our part. That we needed to provide office space, we needed to provide a safe environment, an objective environment.
We're also actually appealing to the American Psychological Association to change their ethics code to include protection for secondary trauma in research subjects, and not just subjects, but in researchers.
And last but not least, and there's a whole host, I'm not going to go through all of them. One of the other things, I was individually meeting with the coders each week when they would come over and return the films, and we were renting the films because we didn't want to buy any of these, so it was a long process. So when they would come over to get the new films, we would always talk, maybe for 5 minutes, sometimes for half an hour, 45 minutes about what was going on, but it was always individual. We should have had a space once a week for the coders themselves to meet and to share what was going on and talk about their experiences. And we raise that for people who are, again, interested in doing this type of research, at least have an idea, the mistakes that we made, learn from them, that these don't have to be repeated. And
hi, in a couple of the speeches I've noticed the comment of cultural complicity, and I want to know, how do you go about handling another element to the argument of, well, it's free speech, you may not think it's an art, I may think it's an art, I may think it's this or this, and so when you try to attack it, you are then perceived as, you're now infringing on my right, you're now infringing on my perception, and he might be an example of that. And so you have this, well, it's all relative, so there's almost like this hands-off approach. So even as a culture, when you want to fight it, you're forced into complicity because you don't want to be seen as a person who's censoring. And I know it's not related directly to your research, but how do you handle that? What should people do? I mean, how can you even educate people? How can you even get people talking when the very thing you want people to talk about will only be perceived as censorship, invasion of First Amendment speech rights, so on and so forth? So that's just my question.
Yeah, just, and again, it's somewhat outside of our research, and so I'm just briefly going to address it. First off, number one, Bob Jensen has written extensively on this topic about the red herring of the First Amendment issue and censorship. And I think he does an incredible job of getting around it. The second statement I'll make, and this is not something that I thought of on my own, this comes from Chris Kendall, who Bob had mentioned prior, who has a book, and he had pointed out at one point that in the United States, the First Amendment is free speech. And it's somewhat insane to believe that you can have free speech without equality. And I think that if we look to Canada and we look at their Constitution, that their First Amendment is equality. Their Second Amendment is then free speech. So in order for free speech to even exist, equality must exist first and foremost. Without equality, there's no such thing.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Joyce Fulmer, and I work with teens in a rural area of Massachusetts as a pregnancy prevention coordinator. And I just think this is amazing work that you've been doing, and I guess one of the shocking things that you talked about is the percentage, the higher percentage of pleasure responses that occurred to the recipient in the most popular videos. And I guess my question kind of goes, as I've been making the connections through the other presentations today, that we've heard that those who are involved in prostitute and pornography have really been terrorized and tortured and part of violent, aggressive acts. We heard things such as those who were involved in prostitution and had pornography made of them even had significantly more severe PSDTs than those who did not have pornography made of them. And so there's this perception both by the recipient in the videos and the viewers of the videos, so those acts are pleasurable, therefore creating that as a norm in some sense. And I wonder, my question is, if that norm was changed, would then you expect some of the behavior to be changed?
From a psychological standpoint, absolutely. That the response, when you're looking at a behavior and you're trying to determine whether the behavior is likely to occur again, you need to look at what happened after that behavior. And so if what happened after that behavior is something that is hurtful or harmful, then most people would not want to do that again. We recently actually looked at a blog, you sent this information out, where guys were talking about ejaculating on their girlfriends' faces. And they were talking about how much they enjoyed it and what a great kick they got out of it, how much they liked viewing it. But if they accidentally missed and hit the eye or did something to cause her pain, it was like it was all over. It was a buzzkill. And so it was really important to do this in a way that didn't look like it was harmful, hurtful, or degrading.
Yeah, and just real briefly again here, I think some of the things that we were talking about when we were talking about getting at the ideological construction, and also, say, pleasurable responses that are being represented, I think this does speak to the ideological construction again in the way it's overrepresented in some, if I can use that word. I think an analogy, it doesn't work perfectly, but if we think about how the news is constructed and it overreports crime, what's the ideological construct of this? Crime is rampant. You turn on, there's murder, rape, fires, everything occurring, well, they underreport rape on the news, but certainly there's murders, fires, so on and so forth, left and right. What is the ideological construct behind that? Why is it so overreported? And I don't want to attempt to answer that question at this moment, but I think we can start to look at some of the findings in terms of non-normative sexual acts being overrepresented, in terms of pleasure being generated from these sex acts and how that differs from most media texts. And I'm not saying that the way other media texts handle them is good. I'm just saying it's incredibly diametrically different. That at least somebody who perpetrates, and again, I just want to respond to Stu very quickly, and I agree using victim and perpetrator language, but that is, I'm using socially scientific from NT, National Television Violence Study, who exactly reports it just like that. Initiator and receptor of violence, if that is better, I think that's how we have it written up in the paper. I agree, victim is a loaded term. So, you know, perhaps we could change that language. But I think I just wanted to make a couple of those clarifications through there. And that's all. Next question.
Next question.
Hi, speaking about language, you laid out very clearly how you selected the movies you watched, but then you started talking about feminist porn, and I heard you talk about feminist porn, but I also heard you talk about female-directed porn, and I just want to, those aren't the same things, and I just wanted you to clarify maybe what you meant by that.
Absolutely, and I appreciate you pointing out the distinction. We put feminist in quotes on the slide on purpose. Earlier today we heard a talk in which people, I can't remember if it was Rebecca was saying that you know, people have tried to construct a feminist, sexually explicit image, and oftentimes they have reduced that to saying if it's female directed then it must be feminist, and what we're trying to say is that that reductionism doesn't hold. It's not feminist because it's female directed, and so absolutely you're right, we're not trying to claim that that is feminist porn. Thank you.
This will be our last question.
Okay, two very brief points I'd like to make. First of all, in response to the very first question, I think it's really quite reductive to have to say this, but I think we all make assumptions in research. I'd like to thank you for making your assumptions very explicit today, because I think that helps us contextualise your research, and I think if all researchers were as clear and careful about their assumptions, we'd have much better research, so thank you for that. And the second point was really trying to make the connection between some of your findings and debates we've had more generally today about the way we might talk about the reality of pornography. And it's just really to encourage a dialogue where we think both about the reality and the fantasy of pornography, because I was really, really struck by the findings about the extent to which women express pleasure in degradation and pornography. And I think I've probably written this down wrongly, but I think earlier Melissa said something about every single thing happening in pornography is happening to a woman right then. And I think we need to be able to talk about those things that are happening to a woman right then. She is being penetrated, she might be being choked, and also those things that are actually not happening, that she's expressing pleasure, that this is also a fiction. So I think we need a way of talking about pornography as both a reality and a fiction, and we need to be really careful about reading the reality of pornography, because if we want to say that every rape in pornography is a rape, then the counter-argument to that would be that every sexual pleasure in pornography is sexual pleasure. So I think we just need to be really careful about that.
Good point.
All right, then thank you so much for the panel, Bob, Anna, and Michelle. I also